My son took everything I had, 42 years of savings, because his wife said it was for family. I didn't argue. I just smiled, signed the withdrawal slip, and told him, family always comes first. 3 months later, the bank called him, not me, and what they told him made him drop the phone. That day, he finally learned what family really meant. The morning Helen Ward discovered she had nothing left, the house was unusually quiet. She sat in her old beige recliner, the same one she'd bought after her first full year of night shifts at Brookline General, watching sunlight creep across the faded blue curtains. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. Her tea had gone cold in her hands. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the banking app notification, and the world stopped. Available balance, $0. Helen blinked. She tilted the screen, as if the angle might change the numbers. She refreshed the app once. Twice. A third time. Her hands began to tremble, not from her 66 years, though her joints reminded her of them daily, but from something deeper. A sickening pull in her chest that happens when the soul understands something the heart refuses to accept. She called the bank. A cheerful automated voice asked her to select from a menu. She pressed 0 repeatedly until a human answered. Mrs. Ward, how can I help you today? My account, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's empty. There was typing. A pause. Yes, ma'am. I see multiple transfers made online over the past 2 weeks. Large wire transfers totaling $186,000. Helen's breath caught. Her entire life. Every double shift. Every skipped meal. Every birthday she'd worked through so Evan could have new shoes. Where did it go? She asked, though somewhere inside, she already knew. To an account under the name Evan Patrick Ward. It appears to be a joint access account. Do you want to file a? Helen hung up. The silence that followed felt like drowning. The landline rang, the old rotary phone she kept in the kitchen out of habit. Helen? Helen, honey, it's Martha. Martha's voice was bright, excited, completely unaware. Have you seen Evan's Instagram? Girl, he's living like royalty. He and that Alyssa are down in Miami Beach with her whole family, fancy restaurants, ocean views, the works. Says right there in the caption, for family. Isn't that sweet? Helen's throat tightened. I haven't seen it. Well, check it out. Your boy is glowing. You must be so proud. Helen thanked her quietly and hung up. She walked slowly to her bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. She opened the drawer where she kept her old smartphone, the one Evan had given her 2 Christmases ago, calling it an upgrade even though she barely knew how to use it. She wasn't on social media much. But she followed Evan. Quietly. From a distance. The way mothers do when their children grow too busy to call. She found his profile. And there he was. Her son. Her only child. The boy she'd rocked to sleep in a one-room apartment, the boy she'd raised alone after Patrick walked out, the boy she'd given everything to. He stood on a sunlit balcony, champagne glass raised, wearing a crisp white linen shirt she'd never seen before. Alyssa was beside him, radiant in a designer sundress, her arm draped possessively around his waist. Behind them, Alyssa's mother reclined on a cabana chair, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose. The caption read, New beginnings. We deserve this. Palm tree sparkles. And in the comments, Alyssa had written, Grateful for the best mother-in-law in the world, money with wings, revolving hearts, #family first. Helen stared at the screen until it blurred. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, phone in hand, as if holding a burning coal. Then, slowly, so slowly it surprised even her, she smiled. Not the warm smile she'd given Evan his whole life. But something else entirely. Something quiet. Something final. For family, she whispered to the empty room. And then, softer, as if the decision had already been made. All right then. For family. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away beneath the Miami sun, Evan Ward raised his glass without a trace of guilt. See? Alyssa said, sipping from her mimosa. I told you she wouldn't make a fuss. She's too traditional to cause problems. Rhonda, Alyssa's mother, laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. That woman wouldn't know what to do with that kind of money anyway. Better we put it to good use before it all goes to medical bills or some dingy nursing home. Evan said nothing. He stared out at the ocean, the glittering blue stretching endlessly before him. Something churned in his stomach, something small and uncomfortable, but he swallowed it down. He'd learned how to do that as a boy, when there wasn't enough food and his mother would say, "Hold on, baby. We'll eat tomorrow." He'd learned to ignore discomfort. This time would be no different. Back in Tacoma, Helen stood in her living room, surrounded by the ghosts of her choices. On the mantel were photographs, Evan in his kindergarten cap. Evan at his high school graduation. Evan on his wedding day, standing stiffly beside Alyssa while Helen smiled from the edge of the frame. She remembered the last time she tried to visit him, just 2 weeks before the money disappeared. She'd baked his favorite lemon cake, the recipe her own mother had taught her. She'd taken the bus across town, the cake balanced carefully on her lap. When she arrived at his apartment building, the doorman stopped her. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Ward left instructions. No unannounced visitors." "I'm his mother," she'd said, confused. "I understand. But those were his instructions." She'd stood there for a moment, cake in hand, before turning back toward the bus stop. She hadn't cried then either. She'd just walked. That evening, Martha came by with pecan pie and chamomile tea. "You look tired, Hel." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. I can see it in your eyes." Martha set down the tea, her voice gentle. "What are you going to do?" Helen looked up. In her gaze was something new, something Martha had never seen before. "I'm going to smile," Helen said quietly. Martha frowned. "Smile? What do you mean?" "I've cried enough, Martha. I've bent enough. Now I'm going to smile in silence." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Because I have nothing left to lose. Helen." And when a woman has nothing left to lose, Helen continued, her eyes distant, she becomes dangerous. Martha didn't know what to say. So she just squeezed her friend's hand and stayed until the tea went cold. That same night, in a luxury suite overlooking Biscayne Bay, Evan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it absently, expecting another congratulatory message. Instead, he saw a notification from the bank. "Account frozen, suspected fraudulent activity. Contact us immediately." His stomach dropped. "What the hell?" he muttered, staring at the screen. Alyssa looked over his shoulder. "What's wrong?" "The account, it's frozen." "That's impossible. We just transferred." Evan's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. And on the other end, a calm, professional voice said words that would change everything. "Mr. Ward, this is the Fraud Investigation Division. We need to discuss several unauthorized transactions linked to your account, and a claim filed by Helen Ward." Evan's hand went numb. The phone slipped slightly in his grip. Far away, in her small house in Tacoma, Helen Ward sat in her recliner with a notebook open on her lap. She'd written only one sentence. "This is not the end. It is the beginning of my silence. And my silence will hurt more than any scream." She closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and for the first time in weeks, slept peacefully. Sometimes pain doesn't shout. Sometimes it sits quietly, takes notes, and waits for exactly the right moment. And that moment had just begun. Now, before we continue, I'd really love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments, because it warms my heart to see how far these stories reach. And if this one moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe and keep walking with me through the journeys of love, pain, and the quiet lessons life whispers when we least expect them. Now let's continue. To understand how Helen Ward became the kind of woman who could smile through betrayal, you have to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to a girl who learned too young that love costs everything, and that sometimes, the people you sacrifice for are the ones who forget the price. This is the story of 42 years. And how they all led to one quiet morning, one empty account, and one decision that would change everything. Helen's first night at Brookline General Hospital, she was 24 years old and terrified. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile, unforgiving glow. Her uniform was stiff and new, the fabric scratching against her shoulders. She'd bought it secondhand from a nursing student who'd quit after one semester, but she'd washed it 3 times to make it feel like hers. Ward? The head nurse barely looked up from her clipboard. You're on post-op, room 304 through 318. Call if there's bleeding or distress. Otherwise, let them sleep. Helen nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clipped her ID badge to her pocket. Night shift. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The hours no one else wanted. The hours that paid just enough extra to matter. She walked those halls for the first time with Evan's face in her mind. 2 years old. Sleeping in his grandmother's apartment across town because Helen couldn't afford childcare and couldn't afford not to work. Every step she took that night, she took for him. Every 4 lines she checked, every bedpan she emptied, every tired smile she gave to a patient who rang the call bell at 3 a.m., all of it was for Evan. And she told herself it would be worth it. The years blurred together in a rhythm of sacrifice. There were mornings when Helen would stumble off the bus at dawn, her body aching, her eyes burning from exhaustion. She'd walk 3 blocks to her mother's apartment, climb the narrow stairs, and find Evan still asleep in his makeshift bed, a pull-out couch cushion on the floor. She'd kneel beside him, brush the hair from his forehead, and whisper, "Mama's home." Sometimes he'd wake up. Sometimes he wouldn't. On the days he did, he'd wrap his small arms around her neck and ask, "Did you save people, Mama?" "I tried, baby," she'd say, holding him close. "I tried." There were nights when the rain came down so hard that the bus stop offered no shelter. Helen would stand there, soaked to the bone, rocking Evan in her arms because he was too young to understand why they couldn't just go home. The streetlights flickered above them, casting shadows that danced across the wet pavement. She'd hum to him, old hymns her mother taught her, lullabies with no words, just sounds that meant "I'm here, you're safe, we'll be okay." And somehow, they always were. Patrick left when Evan was 2. Not all at once. Not dramatically. He just faded. First, it was late nights at work. Then it was weekends away. Then it was a phone call from a woman Helen had never met, asking if Patrick was home because he'd promised to help her move. Helen didn't fight. She didn't beg. She just looked at the man she'd married, the man who'd promised her forever, and said, "If you're leaving, leave. But don't come back for him unless you mean it." Patrick didn't mean it. He walked out on a Tuesday morning, his duffel bag half empty, his excuse already prepared. "I'm not cut out for this, hell. I need space to figure things out." Helen watched him go from the window of their cramped apartment, Evan balanced on her hip. "Dada?" Evan asked, pointing at the retreating figure. "Dada's going away for a while," Helen said softly. Evan didn't ask again. And Patrick never came back. After that, Helen built their life one small act at a time. She patched Evan's worn uniforms with fabric from old curtains, stitching by lamplight after her shifts. She saved loose change in coffee tins, one for groceries, one for emergencies, one labeled simply Evan's future. She tutored him at the kitchen table every night, even when her eyes drooped with exhaustion. Math problems. Spelling words. History dates she had to look up herself because she'd barely finished high school. "Why do I have to know this, Mama?" he'd ask, frustrated. "Because," she'd say, her voice firm but kind, "You're going to do better than me. You're going to have choices I never had." And he believed her. Because Helen Ward made sure he did. She took extra shifts when his school needed field trip money. She sold her mother's old jewelry when his science fair project required supplies they couldn't afford. She wore the same 3 outfits for 5 years so he could have new shoes every semester. She had one goal, singular and unwavering: give her son a life untouched by struggle. And for a long time, it worked. Evan grew up smart, sharp, ambitious. He earned scholarships, made the honor roll, got into college on a partial grant that Helen supplemented by working double shifts for 8 months straight. He was kind, too. At least, he used to be. He'd call her every Sunday during his freshman year. "How are you, Mom? Are you eating enough? You sound tired." She'd lie and tell him she was fine. He'd believe her because he wanted to. By his junior year, the calls became bi-weekly. Then monthly. Then only on holidays. Helen told herself it was natural. He was building his own life. That's what she'd worked for, wasn't it? But then he met Alyssa. Alyssa Winters arrived in Evan's life like a sudden change in weather, beautiful, confident, and utterly aware of her effect on people. She was a marketing executive at a boutique firm in Seattle. Polished. Poised. The kind of woman who wore tailored blazers and spoke in TED Talk sound bites. When Evan first brought her home, Helen's heart swelled with something close to pride. "My son chose someone successful. Someone who'll push him forward." She made her famous pot roast. Set the table with her best dishes, the ones she'd bought at a thrift store but had never chipped. She even bought fresh flowers. Alyssa smiled through dinner, complimented the food with the kind of politeness that feels rehearsed, and asked Helen questions that sounded interested but weren't. "So, Helen, how long have you lived here?" 38 years, Helen said warmly. "Bought it after Evan started school." "How quaint." Alyssa's eyes swept the room, the faded wallpaper, the mismatched furniture, the handmade curtains. "It's very lived in." Helen caught the pause. The way Alyssa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. But she pushed it aside. "Love is supposed to stretch, not snap," she told herself. Over the next 2 years, Helen watched Alyssa reshape her son. First, it was his wardrobe. "You need to dress like you belong, Evan. People judge." Then his speech. "Don't say, yeah. Say, yes. It sounds more professional." Then his habits. His friends. His visits home. "Do you really need to see your mom every month?" Alyssa would say, loud enough for Helen to overhear on speakerphone. "You're a grown man. She'll understand." And slowly, Evan began to believe her. The visits became shorter. The phone calls felt obligatory. The warmth in his voice cooled to courtesy. When Helen asked if everything was okay, he'd say, "I'm just busy, Mom. Growing up, you know." She nodded and smiled and told herself this was what she'd wanted, for him to grow, to thrive, to need her less. But late at night, alone in her house, she'd sit in that old beige recliner and wonder when needing less had turned into forgetting entirely. The wedding was small. Elegant. Expensive. Alyssa's family filled most of the seats, polished people in designer clothes, talking about investments and vacation homes. Helen sat in the second row, wearing a dress she'd bought on clearance, feeling like a guest at her own son's life. During the reception, Alyssa's mother, Diane, leaned over and said with a tight smile, "You must be so proud. Evan's come so far." "I am," Helen said. "It's amazing what the right influence can do for a person." Helen smiled. Said nothing. But she felt the words like a slap. After the wedding, Evan visited less. Called less. Needed her less. And Helen kept working. Kept saving. Kept loving him from a distance. Because that's what mothers do. They give until there's nothing left. And sometimes, they give even after that. She never saw the storm gathering on the horizon, never imagined that all those years of sacrifice would lead to one empty bank account and one smiling daughter-in-law typing #FamilyFirst under a photo of stolen dreams. She just kept saving. $1 at a time. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered via text message with the kind of casual enthusiasm that should have been Helen's first warning. Evan, hey mom. Alyssa and I want to take you to dinner Saturday. Somewhere nice. Our treat. 6 p.m. Helen stared at her phone, sitting in the hospital break room with her half-eaten sandwich forgotten on the table beside her. They hadn't invited her to dinner in 8 months. The last time was her birthday, and even then, Evan had shown up alone. Alyssa had a work emergency that couldn't wait. But Helen didn't let herself think about that. She just typed back. Helen, I'd love that, sweetheart. Where should I meet you? Evan, we'll pick you up. Wear something nice heart suit. The heart emoji felt like an afterthought. But Helen pretended it wasn't. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Helen stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes, debating between 3 outfits she'd rotated for years. She finally settled on a navy dress, simple, modest, the one Evan had once said made her look elegant. She did her makeup carefully, her hands steadier than they'd been in weeks. Applied the drugstore lipstick she saved for special occasions. Clipped on the pearl earrings her mother had given her before she died. When the doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, Helen's heart fluttered with something dangerously close to hope. She opened the door to find Evan standing there in a charcoal blazer, his hair styled in that effortless way that probably took 15 minutes. Behind him, Alyssa waited in the car, a sleek silver sedan Helen had never seen before. Hey, Mom. Evan leaned in for a quick hug, the kind that barely made contact. You look great. So do you, sweetheart. Helen squeezed his arm, holding on just a second longer than he did. New car? Lease, he said quickly, already turning toward the driveway. Come on, we've got a reservation. The restaurant was the kind of place Helen had only seen in magazine spreads. Soft lighting. White tablecloths. A wine list that required a separate menu. The hostess greeted them by name, leading them to a corner table with a view of the waterfront. Helen felt out of place immediately, like a shadow in a photograph where everyone else was in perfect focus. This is beautiful, she said softly, settling into her chair. We thought you deserved something special, Alyssa said, her smile bright and practiced. She looked stunning in a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than Helen's monthly grocery budget. You work so hard, Helen. We wanted to treat you. Helen's chest warmed. That's very thoughtful. Evan ordered wine, a bottle Helen knew she'd never pronounce correctly. They made small talk through the appetizers, work, weather, the new coffee shop downtown. Surface conversations that felt like skating on ice too thin to trust. But Helen didn't push. She just savored being here, sitting across from her son, pretending for a moment that nothing had changed. Then, halfway through the main course, Alyssa leaned forward, her eyes glimmering with something Helen couldn't quite name. Mom, she said, and Helen noticed she'd started calling her that recently, though it never sounded quite right. We wanted to share some exciting news with you. Evan set down his fork, his expression a careful mixture of enthusiasm and something else. Nervousness, maybe. We're starting something, he said. Something really big. Helen's pulse quickened. Oh. A family investment, Alyssa continued smoothly, as if she'd rehearsed this. We found this incredible opportunity, a duplex property in a developing neighborhood. We'd live in one unit, rent out the other. Build equity. Create generational wealth. She said the words like they were gospel. Generational wealth. That sounds wonderful, Helen said carefully. Have you talked to a bank about financing? We have, Evan said quickly. But the rates are, well, they're not great right now. And we'd need a substantial down payment to make the numbers work. Alyssa reached across the table and placed her hand over Evan's, a gesture that looked almost choreographed. We've been saving for months, but we're still short. And then we thought. She turned to Helen, her smile widening. We thought of you. Helen's stomach tightened. We know you've been careful with your savings, Alyssa continued, her voice honey smooth. And we wouldn't ask if we weren't absolutely certain this is a solid investment. But this is family, Helen. We're building something together. Something that will benefit all of us. There it was. The word that always broke through Helen's defenses. Family. How much would you need? Helen heard herself ask. Evan shifted in his seat. Mom, you don't have to decide right now. 180,000, Alyssa said, her gaze steady. We'd pay you back once we sell the first property, probably within 2 years. With interest, of course. The number hit Helen like a physical blow. $186,000, that's what she had saved. 42 years of night shifts, of skipped meals, of never taking a real vacation. Her entire safety net. That's everything I have, Helen said quietly. Exactly, Alyssa said, as if Helen had just agreed. And that's what makes it so meaningful. You'd be investing in Evan's future. In our future. In family. Helen looked at her son. Really looked at him. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Evan, she said softly. Is this what you want? He hesitated, just for a moment. Then nodded. Yeah, Mom. This could really set us up. Set us up. All of us. But his voice sounded hollow. Borrowed. That night, Helen lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. Outside, a dog barked somewhere down the street. She thought about every conversation she'd ever had with Evan about dreams and security. The talks they'd had when he was young, when he'd asked why they couldn't afford the toys other kids had. Because we're saving for something better, she'd told him. We're building a foundation. She thought about the promise she'd made to herself after Patrick left, that she'd never let Evan feel the instability she'd felt as a child. She thought about the word family and how it had always been her compass, her North Star, the thing that made every sacrifice make sense. And she thought about Alyssa's smile, too perfect, too rehearsed, like a performance instead of a promise. But then she thought about Evan's face at dinner. The way he'd looked when he said, set us up. All of us. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the investment that would finally keep him close. Maybe if she did this, gave him this one last gift, he'd remember who had always been there. By morning, Helen had convinced herself. Giving now will keep them close forever. The bank was quiet on Monday afternoon. Helen walked to the counter with her withdrawal slip already filled out, her hand surprisingly steady. The teller, a young woman named Kimberly who Helen had known for years, looked at the amount and blinked. Mrs. Ward, this is your entire savings account. I know. Are you sure? This is everything. Helen smiled, the same smile she'd given 1,000 times when patients asked if she was okay after a 14-hour shift. It's for family, she said simply. Kimberly hesitated, then processed the transaction. Helen watched the numbers change on the screen. Watched 42 years turn into a single wire transfer. Watched her safety net disappear with a few keystrokes. She signed the receipt, folded it carefully, and placed it in her purse. Thank you, Kimberly. Mrs. Ward, if you ever need. I'm fine, dear. Really. Back home, Helen opened the drawer of her nightstand, the one where she kept the things too precious to lose. Inside was a faded construction paper drawing from Evan's second-grade class. It showed 2 stick figures, one small and one tall, holding hands under a lopsided sun. At the top, in crayon that had bled through the paper, best MOM ever. Helen placed the bank receipt beside it. For a moment, she just stared at them both, the promise and the payment, the past and the present, the mother she'd been and the fool she was becoming. But the irony didn't hit her yet. She just closed the drawer, returned to the kitchen, and started preparing dinner for one. Outside, the sun set in shades of gold and red, and Helen told herself she'd done the right thing. She told herself that for 3 more weeks. Until the day she saw the Instagram post. Until the day the truth became unavoidable. Until the day she finally understood that family meant something very different to the people she'd loved most. The first post appeared 3 days after the money transferred. Helen was folding laundry in her living room, the same basket of scrubs and worn towels she'd washed 100 times before, when her phone buzzed with a notification. Martha Williams tagged you in a post. Helen didn't use social media much, but Martha was persistent about keeping her connected to the world. She opened the app with soap-wrinkled fingers and found herself staring at a screenshot Martha had shared. It was from Alyssa's Instagram. The image showed a sun-drenched balcony overlooking turquoise water. In the foreground, 2 champagne flutes caught the light, bubbles rising in golden liquid. The caption read, "Dreams don't work unless you do. Miami bound. New chapter. New energy. Clinking glasses sparkles #blessed #living my best life." Helen's hands went still on the laundry. Miami. Not Tacoma. Not Seattle. Not anywhere near the family duplex they described over dinner with such careful enthusiasm. She scrolled to Alyssa's profile, her heart beating faster with each swipe. More photos bloomed across her screen like evidence in a crime she didn't want to believe: a marble-countered kitchen with floor-to-ceiling windows. A bedroom with a king-sized bed and designer linens. A rooftop pool reflecting the Miami skyline. And in every photo, Alyssa. Radiant. Triumphant. Posing with the kind of confidence that comes from getting exactly what you want. One image showed Evan in the background, raising a glass toward the camera, his smile wide and unburdened. The caption underneath read, "Couldn't have done this without family. Grateful for the people who believe in us." 2 hearts #family first. Helen read it 3 times. Then she set down her phone very carefully, as if it might shatter, and went back to folding laundry. Her hands moved mechanically, fold, smooth, stack, while something cold and heavy settled in her chest. The posts continued. Over the next 2 weeks, Alyssa's feed became a glossy catalog of a life Helen had unknowingly purchased: designer furniture being delivered, brunch at waterfront restaurants, sunset cocktails with Alyssa's mother, Diane, who posed in oversized sunglasses and linen that never wrinkled. One photo showed a living room staged like something from a magazine spread. The caption, "Home is where the heart is. And the good furniture." Winking face. Another showed Evan and Alyssa at what looked like a yacht club, the words, "Living the dream we always deserved." Helen didn't comment. Didn't like. Didn't reach out. She just watched from a distance, the way she'd learned to watch her son's life unfold without her. She tried to fill the emptiness the way she always had, with work and small kindnesses. She baked pies for the church bake sale, apple, cherry, and the lemon meringue that everyone said was worth the drive. She stood behind the table on Sunday morning, smiling at familiar faces, wrapping slices in wax paper with hands that trembled slightly. "Helen, you outdid yourself," Pastor Green said, buying 3 slices. "These are heaven." "Just keeping busy," she replied, her voice bright and hollow. At the hospital, she picked up extra shifts. Night after night, she walked those fluorescent-lit corridors, tending to patients who thanked her with tired smiles. She restocked supply carts, changed bedding, checked vitals with the kind of precision that comes from decades of repetition. Her coworkers noticed. "Hell, you're here again?" Donna, one of the younger nurses, frowned as Helen clocked in for her 5th consecutive night shift. "Girl, you've got to rest. You're not 25 anymore." "I'm fine," Helen said, tying her hair back. "Just trying to save up a little extra." The lie tasted bitter. Because there was nothing left to save up from. No nest egg. No safety net. Just the paycheck-to-paycheck existence she thought she'd finally escaped. Martha visited on a gray Thursday afternoon, letting herself in with the spare key Helen had given her years ago. She found Helen in the kitchen, kneading dough with flour dusting her forearms like snow. "Helen Ward, you look like death warmed over." Helen didn't look up. "Good to see you too, Martha." "I'm serious." Martha set down her purse and crossed her arms. "You've lost weight. You've got circles under your eyes. And don't think I haven't noticed you working doubles all week. I'm just busy. Busy running yourself into the ground." Martha pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "This is about that money, isn't it? The investment?" Helen's hands paused on the dough. "It's fine." "Fine? Honey, I've seen their Instagram. That's not a duplex. That's a luxury condo in South Beach that probably costs more per month than your mortgage. They're young. They're building their future." "With your past," Martha interrupted, her voice sharper than usual. "Helen, that was your retirement. Your security. Everything you worked for. It was mine to give. And it was theirs to respect." The words hung in the air like smoke. Helen shaped the dough into a ball and set it aside to rise. She washed her hands slowly, watching the water run clear, wishing everything else could be washed away as easily. "They're happy," she said finally. "That's what matters." Martha shook her head. "And what about you?" Helen smiled, that same practiced smile she'd perfected over decades of pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. "I'm fine, Martha." "Really?" But they both knew it was a lie. At night, the house felt different. Helen would sit in her beige recliner, the television on but unwatched, and listen to the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was haunted. Haunted by memories of Evan's laughter echoing through these rooms when he was young. Haunted by the ghost of birthday parties and homework sessions and the thousand small moments that had filled this house with purpose. Now, there was just the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old wood settling. Sometimes she'd catch herself waiting for the phone to ring. For Evan to call and say, "Thanks, Mom. You really helped us out. We couldn't have done this without you." But the phone stayed silent. And the Instagram posts kept coming. The text arrived on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the money had vanished. Helen was getting ready for work, buttoning her scrubs in front of the bathroom mirror, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it absently, expecting a shift reminder or a message from Martha. Instead, she saw Evan's name. Her heart lifted for just a moment, that involuntary flutter of hope that mothers can't quite kill, no matter how many times it betrays them. She opened the message. But it wasn't for her. "Evan, she says Mom's old-fashioned. She'll understand later. Just give it time." Helen stared at the words, reading them once, twice, 3 times. A group text, she realized. Sent to the wrong conversation. Probably meant for Alyssa or one of his friends. Her hands began to shake. Old-fashioned. She'll understand later. As if Helen was a problem to be managed. An obstacle to be navigated around. A relic from a simpler time who just needed to be patient while they enjoyed the life she'd funded. Helen sat down on the edge of the bathtub, phone still glowing in her hand. And for the first time since the money disappeared, tears came. Not loud, wrenching sobs. Just quiet tears that slid down her cheeks and dripped onto her scrubs, leaving dark spots on the pale blue fabric. She cried for the boy she'd raised alone. For the mother she'd been, devoted, selfless, foolish. For the 42 years that had just bought her the privilege of being called old-fashioned by the son she'd given everything to. Then, slowly, something shifted. The tears stopped. Helen looked at herself in the mirror, at her red-rimmed eyes, her tired face, her trembling chin. And she smiled. Not the warm smile she'd given Evan his whole life. Not the practiced smile she showed patients and neighbors and people who asked if she was okay. But something else entirely. Something quiet and cold and final. I already understand, she whispered to her reflection. Her voice was steady now. Clear. She wiped her face, straightened her scrubs, and picked up her phone. She didn't respond to the text. Didn't call him. Didn't send the hurt, angry message her heart wanted to compose. She just saved the screenshot, carefully, deliberately, and put her phone in her pocket. Then she went to work. Because Helen Ward had spent 42 years learning how to endure. But she was about to learn something new. How to act. And when she did, the echo of their laughter would be the last sound they'd make at her expense. It happened during her shift on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks and 4 days after the text message. Helen was restocking the medication cart in room 412 when the floor tilted beneath her feet. One moment, she was reaching for a box of gauze. The next, the fluorescent lights were spinning overhead like a carousel, and her knees buckled. She heard her name being called from somewhere far away, Helen. Helen, can you hear me? And then everything went dark. When she woke, she was in a bed she'd walked past 1,000 times but never imagined occupying. The ER was bright and loud with the familiar symphony of beeping monitors and hurried footsteps. Donna stood beside her, still in scrubs, her face tight with worry. Welcome back, Donna said softly, squeezing Helen's hand. You scared the hell out of us. Helen tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness pushed her back down. I'm fine. I just need. You're not fine. Dr. Patel appeared at the foot of the bed, chart in hand, his expression serious. Your blood pressure was dangerously low when they brought you in. When's the last time you slept more than 4 hours? Helen didn't answer. Mrs. Ward, he continued, his tone shifting to the one doctors use when they need you to listen, we ran some tests. Your heart is showing signs of strain consistent with chronic exhaustion and stress. Early-stage heart failure, likely exacerbated by overwork and inadequate rest. The words landed like stones in water, heavy, sinking, leaving ripples she couldn't quite process. Heart failure, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. It's manageable, Dr. Patel said quickly. With medication, rest, and lifestyle changes. But Helen, you can't keep working doubles. Your body is telling you it can't sustain this pace. Helen stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes in the acoustic panels. 42 years of night shifts. Of pushing through exhaustion. Of telling herself she could rest later, after Evan was settled, after she'd saved enough, after everything was secure. And now her body was calling in the debt. How long do I need off? She asked quietly. Minimum 2 weeks. Preferably a month. Helen closed her eyes. A month without pay. A month without the distraction of work. A month alone with the silence of her empty house and the echo of her mistakes. Okay, she whispered. Okay. They kept her overnight for observation. Helen lay in the narrow hospital bed, listening to machines monitor the heart that had apparently been breaking without her permission, and tried not to think about the bills that would come. Her phone sat on the bedside table, dark and silent. She hadn't called Evan. Hadn't told him she was in the hospital. Part of her wondered if he'd even care. The larger part of her didn't want to find out. She was discharged Friday morning with a prescription for beta blockers, strict instructions to rest, and Donna's promise to drive her home. The house looked smaller somehow when she walked through the door. Dimmer. As if the walls had contracted while she was gone. Helen made tea she didn't drink and sat in her recliner, staring at nothing in particular, when the phone rang. Not her cell phone. The landline. She almost didn't answer. But habit is a powerful thing, and Helen had been answering phones for other people her entire life. Hello? Mrs. Ward? An unfamiliar male voice, professional but tinged with awkwardness. This is James Chin from Cascade Property Management. I'm calling about your mortgage payment. Helen frowned. My mortgage is on autopay. There shouldn't be. Yes, ma'am, I understand. That's why I'm calling. Your payment for this month was returned for insufficient funds. The room tilted again, just like it had in the hospital corridor. That's impossible, Helen said, her hand tightening on the phone. I have autopay set up through my savings account. According to the bank, the account the payment was drafted from no longer has sufficient funds to cover the amount. Helen's heart, her failing, exhausted heart, began to pound. What account? She asked, her voice barely steady. The home equity line of credit linked to your checking, ma'am. Account ending in 7743. I don't have a home equity line. A pause. Paper rustling. Mrs. Ward, according to our records, you opened the line 2 months ago. The documentation was processed through First National Bank. I never opened. Helen stopped, a cold dread spreading through her chest. I need to call the bank. She hung up before he could respond. Her hands shook as she dialed First National, navigating the automated system with growing panic until finally, mercifully, a human voice answered. First National Bank, this is Stephanie. How can I help you? My name is Helen Ward. Account number 4782-9156-7743. I need to know about a home equity line that was supposedly opened on my account. Typing sounds. A pause that stretched too long. Yes, Mrs. Ward. I show a home equity line of credit opened on September 8. Current balance is $186,000, which was transferred to a linked account on September 12. The date. The exact date she'd wired the money to Evan. I didn't authorize a home equity line, Helen said, her voice cracking. I authorized a wire transfer from my savings account. Ma'am, the transfer was processed from the equity line, not your savings. And there's a co-signer on the account, more typing. Evan Ward. The funds were transferred to an account in his name. Helen's vision blurred. I never signed anything about a home equity line. I only signed the wire transfer authorization. Mrs. Ward, Stephanie's voice softened with something like pity, we have your signature on file. The documents were notarized and processed according to standard procedures. Let me be very clear, Helen said, each word deliberate despite the tremor in her voice. I did not sign any home equity paperwork. I didn't even know what that was until 2 minutes ago. Silence. Then, ma'am, I think you might want to come into the branch. And perhaps speak with our fraud department. Fraud, Helen repeated, the word tasting like ash. If you're saying you didn't authorize this, then someone may have forged your signature. That's a serious allegation, but we'll need to investigate. Helen sat in her recliner, phone pressed to her ear, and finally understood the full scope of what had been done to her. Not just the loss of her savings. Not just the betrayal of her trust. But the theft of her home. Her safety. The foundation she'd built brick by brick over 4 decades. They hadn't just taken her money. They'd mortgaged her entire life. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough in the bathroom weeks ago when she'd read Evan's misdirected text. She'd shed every tear her body could produce for a son who saw her as old-fashioned, for a daughter-in-law who saw her as a resource to be depleted. There were no tears left. Just a cold, crystalline clarity. Helen hung up the phone and sat in the growing darkness of her living room as the sun set outside her window. She thought about the way Alyssa had smiled at dinner, so rehearsed and perfect. The way Evan had avoided her eyes when they'd asked for the money. The ease with which they'd spent 42 years of her life on champagne and ocean views and designer furniture. And she thought about the signature, her name, forged in ink she'd never held, on documents she'd never seen. Someone had stolen her handwriting. Her identity. Her trust. And called it family. That night, Helen opened the drawer of her nightstand where she'd placed the bank receipt beside Evan's childhood drawing. She pulled out the small leather notebook she'd carried in her purse for years, the one where she used to jot down recipes and grocery lists and little reminders to herself. She turned to a fresh page. And in her careful, shaky handwriting, the real one, the one that belonged to her, she wrote. Love signed what reason never would. She stared at the words for a long moment, then closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Tomorrow, she would call the fraud department. Tomorrow, she would begin to fight. But tonight, she sat in her chair and let the silence teach her something she should have learned years ago. Sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you worst. And sometimes, the only way to save yourself is to stop saving them. The walls of her house seemed to contract around her, but Helen Ward, exhausted, heartbroken, and finally awake, did not collapse. She straightened her spine. She took her medication. And she began to plan. Arthur Bennett's office sat on the third floor of an aging brick building in downtown Tacoma, sandwiched between a bail bondsman and a tax preparation service. Helen climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, her heart medication making her slightly dizzy. She carried a manila folder stuffed with every document she'd been able to gather: bank statements, the wire transfer receipt, printed emails, and the letter from the bank's fraud department requesting she come in for an interview. The door read, Bennett and Associates, Financial Law. She knocked. Come in, a familiar voice called. Arthur looked older than she remembered, his hair more gray than brown now, reading glasses perched on his nose, but his smile was the same warm one she'd known since their community college days, back when they were both working full-time and studying at night. Helen Ward. He stood, crossing the small office to embrace her. It's been too long. 5 years, she said, returning the hug briefly. Martha's retirement party. That's right. He gestured to the chair across from his cluttered desk. I was surprised to get your call. You said it was urgent? Helen sat down, the folder heavy in her lap. I need help, Arthur. And I need you to be honest with me, even if it hurts. His expression shifted, the smile fading into something more serious. Okay. Tell me what happened. She told him everything. The dinner. The request for investment. The wire transfer she'd authorized. The Instagram posts from Miami. The misaddressed text. Her collapse at work. And finally, the phone call about the home equity line she'd never opened. Arthur listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Do you have copies of what you signed? He asked finally. Just this. Helen pulled out the wire transfer authorization, the single piece of paper the bank teller had given her that day. This is all I ever signed. Arthur studied it carefully, then turned to his computer. And the bank says there are other documents? Home equity paperwork with your signature? That's what they claim. They said it was notarized. Did you go to a notary? No. I only went to the bank once. I signed this, and they processed the wire transfer. That's it. Arthur leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Helen, I'm going to need to request copies of all the documentation from the bank. With your permission, I'll file a formal inquiry into the home equity line opening. But I need you to prepare yourself. For what? If your signature was forged, this isn't just fraud. It's identity theft and potentially elder financial abuse. That's federal. And if your son was involved, even peripherally. Helen's hands tightened on the folder. He's involved, Arthur. The money went to him. Being a recipient doesn't necessarily make him the forger. But it does make him complicit if he knew the source was fraudulent. So what do we do? Arthur met her eyes. We find out who signed your name. And we get your life back. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of Arthur filing requests, making calls, and navigating the bureaucratic maze of financial institutions and legal documentation. Helen spent those weeks in a strange limbo, not quite working, she was still on medical leave, not quite resting, her mind wouldn't allow it. She organized her house. Tended her small garden. Baked pies she gave to neighbors. And waited. Evan never called. The Instagram posts continued, Alyssa at a spa, Evan at a golf course, the two of them at some fundraiser gala dressed like people Helen no longer recognized. One caption read, investing in yourself is the best investment you'll ever make. Helen stared at it for a long time before closing the app. Arthur called on a Tuesday afternoon. Can you come to the office? I have the documents. Helen was there within the hour. Arthur's desk was covered with papers, printouts, highlighted sections, sticky notes forming a constellation of evidence. Sit down, Helen. She did. He slid a document across the desk. This is the home equity line application. Filed September 5th, 3 days before your wire transfer. Helen picked it up with shaking hands. There, at the bottom, was a signature that looked like hers. The H curved just right. The ward had that distinctive loop she'd practiced for years. But it wasn't hers. It's close, Arthur said quietly. Very close. But look here, he pointed to the E in Helen. Your E always has a small tail at the end. Force of habit from the way you were taught to write in the 60s. This one doesn't. And here, he pointed to another section. The pressure is different. This was signed by someone studying your signature, probably from another document. But it wasn't you. Can you prove it? Yes. I've already contacted a forensic handwriting expert. But Helen, there's something else. He slid another document across the desk. The property deed. For the Miami condo. Helen looked at it, her eyes scanning the legal text until they landed on the owner's name. Not Evan Patrick Ward. Alyssa Marie Winters. Just her name. Sole owner. Evan's not on the deed. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. No. The property was purchased entirely in Alyssa's name. Your money, or rather, the money from the fraudulent equity line, was wired to your son's account. But within 24 hours, it was transferred to Alyssa's personal account. And she bought the condo. Alone. Helen stared at the paper, the implications cascading through her mind like falling dominoes. He doesn't even own it, she said. No. Which means she played both of you. Arthur removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. My guess? She forged the documents, used Evan as the go-between to make it seem legitimate, and then took everything. Your son might not have known about the forgery, but he definitely benefited from it. And he definitely didn't stop it. No, Arthur agreed quietly. He didn't. Helen sat in silence, the documents spread before her like evidence at a crime scene. She thought about Alyssa's smile at dinner. The rehearsed enthusiasm. The way she'd said family like it was a magic word that could open any door. She thought about Evan's averted eyes. The text calling her old-fashioned. The Instagram posts celebrating a life built on theft. And she thought about herself, the woman who'd spent 42 years believing that love and sacrifice were the same thing. Arthur, she said finally, her voice steady. What are my options? You can file a fraud claim. Report the forgery. The bank will have to investigate, and if we're right, which I believe we are, they'll have to restore your equity line to zero and potentially come after whoever committed the fraud. Alyssa. Most likely. But Helen, he leaned forward, his expression grave. If you pursue this, it will blow up your son's life. Even if he didn't forge the documents, he'll be investigated. His accounts will be frozen. His name will be attached to a fraud case. His career, his reputation, everything will be ruined, Helen finished. I know. Are you prepared for that? Helen looked at the deed again. At Alyssa's name in bold typeface. At the address in Miami where her son was living in a home purchased with her stolen security. Arthur, she said quietly, I've already lost my son. The boy I raised wouldn't have done this. The man he became, he left me a long time ago. I just didn't want to see it. So what are you fighting for? Helen met his eyes, and in hers, Arthur saw something he'd never seen before. Not anger. Not even grief. Just a cold, clear purpose. My peace, she said simply. I'm fighting for my peace. A calm settled over Helen in that moment. Not the calm of acceptance or forgiveness, but the calm of decision. She'd spent her whole life as a nurse, patching wounds and healing others. She'd learned how to stitch cuts cleanly, how to remove infection before it spread, how to know when something was too damaged to save. Now, finally, she was going to heal herself. And healing required cutting away what was rotten. Even if what was rotten wore her last name. File the claim, Helen said, her voice unwavering. All of it. The fraud, the forgery, everything. I want my name cleared. I want my equity line zeroed. And I want whoever did this held accountable. Arthur nodded slowly. It's going to get ugly, Helen. It already is ugly, she replied. Now it's just going to be honest. She stood, gathering the documents and placing them back in Arthur's hands. Do what needs to be done. I will. He hesitated. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About Evan. About all of it. Helen smiled, that new smile, the one that held no warmth but infinite strength. Don't be sorry, Arthur. I'm not. She walked out of his office with her back straight and her head high. Behind her, Arthur Bennett watched her go and thought that Helen Ward had finally stopped being a victim. And that meant someone else was about to learn what it cost to betray a woman who had nothing left to lose. The paperwork took 3 days to file. Helen sat in Arthur's office each morning, signing her real signature on document after document: fraud claims, elder abuse reports, formal disputes with the bank, requests for forensic analysis, statements for the police. Her hand cramped after the first hour, but she didn't stop. Each signature was an act of reclamation, proof that her name still belonged to her, even if someone had tried to steal it. This goes to the bank's fraud division, Arthur explained, sliding another form across the desk. This one goes to the state attorney general. This one initiates the freeze on any accounts linked to the fraudulent equity line. Will they freeze Evan's accounts too? Any account that received funds from the compromised source, yes. It's standard procedure during a fraud investigation. Helen signed without hesitation. Arthur watched her carefully. You're very calm. I'm tired of being upset, Helen said simply. Upset doesn't fix anything. No, Arthur agreed. But it's human. So is survival. The bank moved faster than Helen expected. Within 48 hours of Arthur filing the fraud claim, First National launched an internal investigation. The forensic handwriting analyst confirmed what Arthur had already suspected: the signature on the home equity documents was a forgery, sophisticated but identifiable. On Thursday morning, Helen received a formal letter. Account hashtag 4782-9156-7743, fraudulent activity investigation. Dear Mrs. Ward. After review of the documents and expert analysis, we have determined that the home equity line of credit opened on your account was processed using falsified signatures and unauthorized documentation. Effective immediately, the equity line has been closed and the balance adjusted to $0. All linked accounts have been frozen pending further investigation. We sincerely apologize for this breach and are working with law enforcement to identify the responsible parties. Helen read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her growing file of evidence. Zero balance. Her home was safe. It was the first victory. Small, but hers. That same afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table with a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the kind she'd bought years ago for thank-you notes she never had time to write. She picked up her pen and began. Dear Evan. She paused, the pen hovering over the paper. There were 1,000 things she wanted to say. 1,000 accusations, questions, pleas for explanation. But in the end, she wrote only what mattered. You didn't lose my money. Money can be earned back, saved again, rebuilt. You lost my trust, and that was the only fortune that ever mattered. I raised you to know the difference between taking and earning, between family and exploitation. Somewhere along the way, you forgot. Or maybe you never learned. I won't call. I won't visit. I won't watch your life unfold on screens that show me only what you want me to see. I'm done being your safety net. You're going to have to learn to fall on your own. But know this, I will always be your mother. And mothers don't stop loving. They just stop enabling. Helen. She read it once, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it before she could second-guess herself. Then she disappeared. Not physically, she remained in her small house in Tacoma, tending her garden and slowly returning to work on reduced hours. But digitally, she vanished. She unfollowed Evan on Instagram. Blocked Alyssa. Turned off notifications from Facebook. Deleted the family group chat where Evan occasionally sent updates no one asked for. She didn't announce her departure. Didn't post a farewell message. Didn't explain. She just stopped being visible. And the silence, her silence, became louder than any accusation. Evan noticed within a week. He'd posted a photo of himself at some tech conference, smiling beside people Helen didn't recognize. Usually, his mother would like it within hours, sometimes adding a comment, "So proud of you, sweetheart," or "You look so professional." This time, nothing. He checked her profile. She hadn't posted in weeks. He sent a text, "Hey mom, you okay? Haven't heard from you." No response. He tried calling. It rang through to voicemail. "Mom, it's me. Just checking in. Call me back when you get this." She didn't. Another week passed. Then another. Evan's texts grew more frequent, tinged with confusion. "Mom, are you getting my messages? Is everything all right? You're worrying me. Can you at least let me know you're okay?" Helen saw every message. Read every word. And replied to none of them. Because she'd learned something important, her presence in his life had been so constant, so unconditional, that he'd stopped noticing it. Now her absence would teach him what he'd taken for granted. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away, cracks were forming in paradise. Evan's credit card declined at dinner. "That's weird," he muttered, pulling out another one. Also declined. Alyssa's smile tightened. "Did you forget to pay the bill?" "No, everything's on autopay." He checked his banking app and froze. "Account temporarily restricted, contact your bank." What the hell? He called the bank from the restaurant parking lot, Alyssa standing beside him with her arms crossed. "Mr. Ward," the representative said carefully, "your account has been flagged due to an ongoing fraud investigation related to funds you received in September. All transactions are frozen until the investigation concludes." Fraud investigation? What are you talking about? "I'm not at liberty to discuss details, sir. You should contact the investigative division directly. The number is..." Evan hung up, his hands shaking. "What did they say?" Alyssa demanded. "Something about fraud. My accounts are frozen." Her expression shifted, just for a moment, and Evan saw something he'd never seen before. Fear. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You didn't do anything wrong." "No, but..." He stopped, a sick realization dawning. "The money. The money from my mom. They said it was related to funds from September." Alyssa's face went pale. "They can't freeze your account for that. Your mother gave you that money willingly." "Did she?" Evan asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Over the next 2 weeks, Alyssa changed. The warm, confident woman Evan had fallen for became paranoid, snappish. She spent hours on her phone, texting people he didn't know. She hired a lawyer she wouldn't let him meet. "Is the condo in your name?" she asked one night, her voice sharp. "What?" "No, it's in yours. You said it was better for tax purposes." "Right. Good. That's good." "Alyssa, what's going on?" "Nothing. Just making sure everything's protected." "Protected from what?" She didn't answer. Arguments began. Small at first, about money, about his mother, about why his accounts were still frozen. "Maybe you should call your mom," Alyssa said one night, her voice dripping with disdain. "Ask her what she told the banks." "I've tried calling her. She won't answer." "Of course she won't. She's probably behind this whole thing." Evan stared at his wife. Behind what, exactly? But Alyssa just turned away. In Tacoma, Helen Ward lived in stillness. She worked her shifts. Came home. Tended her garden. Read books she'd been meaning to read for years. She didn't check Evan's social media. Didn't drive past places that reminded her of him. Didn't torture herself with memories. She just existed. Quietly. Patiently. Martha visited one afternoon, finding Helen on the back porch, deadheading roses. "You seem different," Martha observed. "How so?" "Peaceful. Like you finally put something down that was too heavy to carry." Helen smiled. "Maybe I have." "Have you heard from Evan?" "No." And nothing." Helen snipped a dead bloom, watching the petals fall. "I'm done chasing him, Martha. I'm done explaining myself, defending myself, shrinking myself to fit into a life where I'm only welcome when I'm useful." Martha squeezed her shoulder. "That's growth, honey." "No," Helen said softly. "That's survival." Arthur called the following Monday. "The investigation is moving forward. The forensic evidence is solid. The police are preparing to file charges." "Against Alyssa?" "Yes." "And Helen," he paused. "They're going to want to interview Evan. He's not being charged, but he's connected to this. His name is all over the money trail." "I know. Are you ready for what comes next?" Helen looked out her kitchen window at the garden she'd planted, the house she'd saved, the life she was finally learning to live for herself. "I've been ready for weeks, Arthur. I'm just waiting for everyone else to catch up." Because Helen Ward had learned something in her 66 years of life, something forged in hospital corridors and lonely bus stops and 42 years of putting everyone else first. Sometimes justice doesn't announce itself with trumpets and proclamations. Sometimes it waits in silence. It watches. It gathers. It prepares. And when the moment is exactly right, not a second before, not a second after, it steps forward and settles every debt. Helen wasn't shouting anymore. She was waiting. And her wait was almost over. The call came on a gray Thursday morning in March, 6 months after Helen had mailed her final letter. Evan sat in a hotel room in Tampa, not the luxury suite in Miami, but a roadside motel with peeling wallpaper and a view of the parking lot. The condo was gone. Alyssa was gone. Everything was gone. His phone had been ringing for hours. Lawyers. Banks. Numbers he didn't recognize with area codes that made his stomach turn. Finally, one word appeared on the screen that made his hands start shaking: Mom. He stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Mom?" "Hello, Evan." Her voice was calm. Steady. Like she was commenting on the weather. "Mom, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for months." "I know." The simplicity of those 2 words stopped him cold. "I need your help," he said, his voice cracking. "Everything's falling apart. The investigators, the fraud charges, they're saying you reported me. That you told them I forged documents." "Mom, what did you do?" Silence stretched across the line. In Tacoma, Helen stood in her garden, phone pressed to her ear, dirt under her fingernails from the morning's planting. The spring sun was warm on her shoulders. The roses she'd pruned last fall were blooming again. "I told them the truth," she said quietly. "That someone forged my signature. That my home equity line was opened without my knowledge. That $186,000 disappeared from my life. But I didn't forge anything. That was Alyssa, she must have." "Did you know, Evan?" "Know what?" That the documents were forged. That she'd stolen my signature. That the money came from a fraudulent equity line instead of my savings account. He hesitated. Just for a second. But Helen heard it. I didn't know the specifics. Did you ask? Her voice remained even, almost gentle. When the money appeared in your account, $186,000, did you question where it came from? Did you wonder why it was so much? Did you call me to confirm? You said it was fine. You said family comes first. I said a lot of things, Evan. Most of them were lies I told myself so I could sleep at night. She knelt beside a rosebush, examining new growth. But I'm done lying. To you. To myself. To everyone. Mom, please. His voice broke. They froze everything. The accounts, the credit cards. Alyssa's gone, she took what was left and disappeared. I think she's out of the country. They're saying I could face charges as an accomplice. Could you? What? Face charges. Are you an accomplice, Evan? The question landed like a stone in still water. I didn't forge anything, he repeated, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. No, Helen agreed. But you spent everything. You stood on balconies with champagne and posted about new beginnings. You called me old-fashioned in a text you meant for someone else. You let me become invisible while you lived in luxury purchased with my security. Evan closed his eyes. You saw that text. I saw everything. Helen's voice remained steady, but something harder edged into it. I saw the Instagram posts. The designer furniture. The ocean views. I saw my entire life turned into your vacation while you smiled and said it was for family. I thought, he stopped, unsure what he'd actually thought. Alyssa said you'd understand. That you'd want this for us. I wanted you to be happy, Helen interrupted. But not like this. Never like this. A siren wailed somewhere outside Evan's motel window. He pressed his palm against his forehead, feeling the weight of months crashing down. What am I supposed to do? What everyone does when they fall, Helen said. You get up. You face what you've done. You rebuild. How? They're investigating me for elder abuse. My name is connected to fraud charges. My accounts are frozen. Alyssa's gone, his voice rose with panic. Mom, I have nothing. No savings, no credit, nowhere to go. Now you understand. The words were soft. Devastating. Understand what? What it feels like, Helen said, to have everything taken by someone you trusted. To look at your bank account and see zero. To realize the people you sacrificed for saw you as a resource, not a person. Evan's throat tightened. You're punishing me. No, sweetheart. And for the first time, Helen's voice carried something that sounded almost like sadness. I'm teaching you. The same way life taught me. Through consequences. But I'm your son. Which is why this hurts. Helen stood, brushing dirt from her knees. If you were anyone else, I could forget you. Move on. But you're not anyone else. You're the boy I raised alone. The child I gave everything to. And that makes this so much worse. Then help me, Evan begged. Please. Just tell them it was all Alyssa. That I didn't know. I can't lie for you, Evan. Not anymore. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But I will tell you this, Alyssa won't get away with what she did. What do you mean? The Miami condo. The one in her name. What about it? Helen's voice carried a note of something Evan had never heard before, quiet, cold satisfaction. It's been seized. Legal restitution for fraud. The court traced the fraudulent funds directly to that purchase. Alyssa forged my signature, and her signature is all over those property documents. Evan's breath caught. So she'll be charged. If they find her, Helen agreed. But she's smart. She ran the moment the investigation started. Left you behind to face everything alone. The truth of it settled over Evan like ice water. Alyssa had used him. Used his mother. Used their love and trust and family bonds as tools to build her own empire. And the moment it crumbled, she'd vanished, leaving him holding the wreckage. I loved her, he whispered. I know. Helen's voice softened slightly. And I loved you enough to let you make your own mistakes. But Evan, this wasn't just a mistake. This was theft. Betrayal. It was 42 years of my life stolen and spent on champagne sunsets while I worked double shifts to keep my house. Silence. Then, barely audible, I'm sorry. I know you are. Helen looked up at the sky, watching clouds drift past. But sorry doesn't give me back those years. It doesn't undo the nights I lay awake wondering where I went wrong. It doesn't fix what's broken between us. Then what do? You face it. All of it. You talk to the investigators. You tell them everything you know about Alyssa. You cooperate fully. And then, she paused. Then you learn to build a life with your own hands instead of someone else's sacrifice. Will you? His voice cracked. Will you ever forgive me? Helen closed her eyes. The question she'd been dreading. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe someday. But not today. Today, I'm still learning how to forgive myself for enabling you. I don't know how to do this alone. Neither did I, Helen said. But I learned. You will too. She heard him crying now, real, broken sobs that sounded like the boy he used to be, before Alyssa, before Miami, before everything went wrong. Part of her wanted to comfort him. To tell him it would be okay. To be the mother who fixed everything. But she didn't. Because sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is let her child fall. Goodbye, Evan. She ended the call before he could respond. Helen stood in her garden, phone in hand, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for decades. Around her, roses bloomed. Birds sang. The world continued its quiet turning. And for the first time in 42 years, Helen Ward felt something close to peace. Not because her son had suffered. But because she'd finally stopped sacrificing herself to prevent his suffering. She'd learned what every mother eventually must: love isn't measured by what you're willing to give. It's measured by what you're wise enough to keep. The balcony faced east, catching the sunrise every morning in shades of coral and gold. Helen stood there now, watering the terracotta pots she'd arranged along the railing, jasmine, hibiscus, and the same roses she'd grown in Tacoma. The Miami heat was different from Washington's rain, but the flowers adapted. Just like she had. 14 months had passed since that phone call in her garden. The legal proceedings had been swift once Alyssa's fraud became undeniable. The forged signatures. The falsified documents. The paper trail leading directly to the Miami condo purchased with stolen funds. The court had seized the property as restitution, transferring the deed to Helen's name, compensation for 42 years converted to square footage and ocean views. Alyssa was still gone. Somewhere in South America, the investigators suspected. Beyond extradition. Beyond consequence. But Helen had stopped thinking about Alyssa months ago. She'd learned that peace doesn't come from watching your enemies fall. It comes from releasing the weight of expecting justice to feel satisfying. Morning, Helen. Mrs. Chen from 4B waved from her balcony next door, tending her own collection of orchids. Good morning, Margaret. Book club tonight, don't forget. We're finally discussing the Toni Morrison you recommended. I wouldn't miss it. This life was smaller than the one in Tacoma. Quieter. But it was hers, built not from sacrifice, but from reclamation. She worked part-time at a nearby clinic, teaching young nurses the skills she'd perfected over 4 decades. She volunteered at the community center on Thursdays. She joined a watercolor class where her hands, steadier now with proper medication and rest, learned to paint the ocean she saw every day. People asked, sometimes, how a retired nurse could afford a condo in South Beach. Helen would smile that new smile, the one that held mysteries she no longer felt obligated to explain, and say simply, it was a family investment. In education. Most people nodded and didn't press further. The ones who knew her story understood the weight of those words. The knock came on a humid Tuesday afternoon when the air was thick with the promise of rain. Helen was reading on the couch, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a cup of tea cooling on the side table. She wasn't expecting visitors. She opened the door to find Evan standing in the hallway. He looked different. Thinner. His hair was longer, touched with gray she didn't remember. His clothes were simple, jeans and a plain t-shirt, nothing like the designer outfits she'd seen in those Instagram posts. His eyes were hollow, but clear. Sober in a way that went beyond alcohol. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Helen's hand tightened on the doorknob. She'd imagined this moment countless times, what she'd say, how she'd feel, whether she'd be angry or cold or unmoved. But standing here, looking at her son, really seeing him for the first time in years, she felt only a tired sort of sadness. Evan. I know I shouldn't be here. He shifted his weight, unable to meet her eyes. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. But he swallowed hard. I needed to see you. To say, his voice broke. To say I'm sorry. Helen studied him in silence. How did you find me? She asked finally. Arthur. Your lawyer. I called him last month. Asked if you were okay. He said you were. He didn't want to tell me where, but Evan's hands trembled slightly. I'd been working construction in Hialeah for 6 months. Saved enough for a bus ticket. Arthur finally told me this morning. Said it was up to you whether to let me in. And you came anyway. I had to. He looked up then, and Helen saw tears tracking down his weathered face. Mom, I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. What I did, what I let happen, there's no excuse. You gave me everything, and I took more. I let her use you. I let her forge your name. I stood by while your life got stolen because I was too weak to see what was happening. Or maybe I saw it and didn't care enough to stop it. The confession spilled out like poison he'd been holding too long. I lost everything, he continued, his voice raw. The accounts, the credit, the career I thought I was building. Alyssa left me with nothing but debt and investigators asking questions I couldn't answer. I slept in my car for 2 months. Ate from food banks. Worked day labor for cash. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture achingly familiar, the same one he'd used as a little boy when he'd fallen and scraped his knees. And you know what the worst part was, he whispered. Realizing that everything I lost? You'd already lost years ago. And I never even noticed. Helen's throat tightened. I'm not asking for money, Evan said quickly. Or a place to stay. Or anything. I just needed you to know that I understand now. What you sacrificed. What I took. What I threw away. He took a shaky breath. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. And that I'm trying to be better. Trying to be the son you deserved instead of the one I became. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Then Helen stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. Evan's eyes widened. Mom. Come in, she repeated. Before the air conditioning escapes. He stepped inside hesitantly, as if entering sacred ground. The condo was bright and airy, filled with the kind of simple beauty that comes from choosing peace over performance. Plants in the windows. Books on shelves. Watercolors drying on an easel in the corner. Sit, Helen said, gesturing to the couch. He sat. She poured 2 glasses of sweet tea from the pitcher in the refrigerator, an old habit from Tacoma that Miami's heat had made even more necessary. She handed him one and settled into the chair across from him. I've been angry, she said finally. For a long time. Angry at you, at Alyssa, at myself for being blind. You have every right. Let me finish. Her voice was gentle but firm. I was angry. But anger is exhausting. And I spent too many years exhausted. She sipped her tea. So I made a choice. To stop being angry and start being free. How? Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. By understanding that forgiveness isn't earned, Evan. It's lived. Helen set down her glass. You can't earn your way back into my trust. You can't apologize enough or suffer enough to make this right. That's not how healing works. Then what do I do? You live differently, Helen said. You make different choices. You build a life where the person you're becoming wouldn't make the mistakes the person you were made. And maybe, eventually, those choices become who you are. Evan's hands shook around his glass. Can you ever forgive me? Helen looked at her son, really looked at him. At the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes and the weight of consequences he was finally carrying. I'm working on it, she said honestly. Some days are easier than others. But Evan, forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's a path. And I'm walking it at my own pace. Can I? He hesitated. Can I walk it with you? Not as your son expecting anything. Just as a man trying to learn how to be better. Helen considered this. Outside, thunder rumbled. The first drops of rain began to fall, washing the balcony clean. You can visit, she said finally. Every other Sunday, if you want. We'll have tea. We'll talk. We'll see what builds from there. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Evan nodded, tears streaming freely now. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Helen said, but her voice carried a hint of warmth. I'm a tough teacher. Ask any nurse who trained under me. Despite everything, Evan laughed, a broken, watery sound that held the ghost of the boy he'd been. They talked until the rain stopped. Surface things, mostly. His construction work. Her watercolor class. The weather. The careful conversation of two people learning to be strangers who might, someday, become family again. When Evan left, Helen stood on the balcony and watched the sun break through the clouds, painting everything in shades of gold. That night, she opened her journal, a habit she'd developed in the quiet months of rebuilding. She wrote in her careful handwriting. They said it was for family. They were right. I just had to redefine what family means. Family isn't just blood. It isn't just sacrifice. Family is choosing, every day, to show up as your truest self and allowing others the space to do the same. Family is boundaries. And grace. And the hard work of forgiveness. Evan came today. He's broken, but he's learning. So am I. We're building something new. Something honest. Something that might, eventually, look like love. She closed the journal and returned to the balcony. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, waves crashing in their ancient rhythm. The sky burned with sunset colors. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing guitar. Helen Ward stood in the home she'd reclaimed from betrayal and felt, for the first time in her 67 years, completely whole. Not because everything was perfect. But because she'd finally learned that peace doesn't come from others giving you what you deserve. It comes from giving yourself what you were always worth.